What if the story of American origins is incomplete? We're taught that the Americas were isolated continents, that indigenous peoples developed independently with no contact from advanced civilizations across the ocean, that history began in 1492 when Columbus arrived. But there's a manuscript, written in the early 1600s by a man named Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxóchitl. And yes, that name is difficult, so we'll just call him Fernando for the rest of this video. Fernando was Aztec nobility, direct descendant of the kings of Texcoco, one of the major cities in the Aztec Empire. He had access to oral histories and records that mostly disappeared after the Spanish conquest. And Fernando documented something that doesn't fit the mainstream narrative. He wrote about ancient migrations, about peoples who came from the far north, who traveled vast distances to settle in Mexico. At the same time, Fernando was writing, European mapmakers were creating charts of the known world, and when they drew the vast territories of northern Asia, the steppes, the unknown lands stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific, they labeled it with one name, Tartaria. Now, mainstream historians tell us Tartaria wasn't a specific kingdom, just a vague European term for regions they didn't understand, a catch-all label for the mysterious north. But what if the connection is real? What if the peoples Fernando described migrating from the north were the same populations Europeans were mapping as Tartarian territories? If that's true, it changes everything. It means the Americas weren't isolated, that sophisticated cultures were connected across continents, that what we call the New World was just the western edge of the Old World, separated by distance but not by origin. Today, we're going to examine this theory, not as proven fact, but as a pattern of evidence that mainstream history overlooks. The migrations Fernando documented, the geographic connections that made it possible, the architectural and cultural similarities that suggest common origins. And we'll look at photographs from 250 years later, images that might show physical evidence of what Fernando was describing, landscapes that raise questions about what existed in the Americas before the approved historical timeline. Because if these connections are real, then the entire story of human civilization needs reconsideration. Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxóchitl, born around 1580, about 28 years after the Spanish conquest of Mexico. His family was significant. His great-great-grandfather had been the ruler of Texcoco. Texcoco was one of the three major cities in the Aztec Triple Alliance. This wasn't a commoner's family. This was royalty. After the conquest, the Spanish systematically destroyed indigenous records, burned codices, demolished temples, killed or silenced the people who remembered the old histories. The goal was erasure. Replace indigenous knowledge with Christian narrative. Make it seem like nothing significant existed before European arrival. But some knowledge survived. Hidden documents, oral traditions passed secretly within noble families, and Fernando became the bridge. He could read and write Spanish. He understood Nahuatl, the Aztec language. He could access the fragments that remained and preserve them in writing before they disappeared entirely. Between 1600 and 1640, Fernando produced several historical works about indigenous peoples. His most comprehensive was about the Chichimeca nations, the peoples who came from the north and became the ancestors of various Mexican civilizations. And in these works, Fernando documented migration stories, oral traditions about ancient peoples traveling from distant lands in the north, organized movements, not random wandering, but deliberate migrations led by chiefs and kings. He described these northern peoples as civilized, not primitive nomads. but organized societies with knowledge of agriculture, architecture, calendar systems. They brought this knowledge with them when they migrated south. Now, Fernando never explicitly wrote the word Tartaria in his texts. That's a European term. He wouldn't have used it to describe indigenous oral traditions, but he did describe vast northern territories, lands beyond the deserts, regions that, on European maps of that same period, were labelled as Tartarian territories. So the connection isn't direct quotation, it's geographic correlation. The northern lands Fernando described as the origin point for Mexican peoples overlap with the regions European mapmakers were calling Tartaria. Is this proof? No. But it's a pattern worth examining, especially when you add the other evidence. Could people actually travel from northern Asia to the Americas in ancient times? Yes, absolutely. The Bering Land Bridge. This isn't theory, it's established geology. During the Ice Age, sea levels dropped over 100 meters. This exposed a massive landmass connecting Siberia to Alaska, not a narrow crossing, a subcontinent over 1,000 kilometers wide. This land bridge existed intermittently over tens of thousands of years, and it wasn't barren ice. It was tundra, grassland, capable of supporting large animal populations and the humans who followed them. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges this. The standard model is that humans cross this bridge in small bands, following game animals, gradually spreading south over thousands of years, eventually populating both continents. But that model assumes primitive technology, small groups, no organization, no sophisticated navigation or planning. What if that assumption is wrong? What if some of the migrations weren't small bands of hunters, but organized movements? Groups with boats capable of coastal navigation, with knowledge of astronomy for long-distance travel, with social structures complex enough to coordinate large-scale migration. That would explain some anomalies in the archaeological record, like the Olmecs. The Olmec civilization emerged around 1200 BC on Mexico's Gulf Coast, and it appeared suddenly, no clear predecessor culture. Just the arrival of sophisticated civilization with writing systems, complex art, astronomical knowledge, and massive construction projects. The famous colossal heads. 17 have been discovered, each carved from single basalt blocks weighing up to 50 tons, transported from quarries over 80 kilometers away. Each head is distinct, individual portraits, probably of rulers, and the facial features are unusual, broader than typical indigenous Mexican populations. Some researchers interpret them as showing external influence, possibly from populations originating in Asia. This is controversial. Most mainstream archaeologists reject the idea of transoceanic contact. They say the features are just artistic style, not literal representation. But if Fernando's migration accounts are accurate, if peoples from the northern regions traveled to Mexico, then Olmec rulers showing features from those northern populations would make sense. Then there's jade. In Mesoamerican cultures, jade was sacred, more valuable than gold, used in the most important religious objects. Mexican jade exists. Deposits in Guatemala and southern Mexico. But the finest jade in some ancient artifacts shows characteristics that researchers debate. Some suggest possible connections to Asian jade sources, though this remains controversial in mainstream archaeology. What's clear is that jade was so important to Mesoamerican cultures that they established long-distance trade networks to acquire it. Whether those networks extended across oceans or just across land is still debated. The point is, geographic connection between Asia and the Americas was possible. The land bridge existed. Maritime routes were feasible, and cultural similarities suggest contact occurred. When Fernando documented oral traditions of northern migrations, he wasn't describing impossibility. He was recording histories that align with what geography and archaeology show was actually possible. If peoples migrated from Asia to the Americas bringing cultural knowledge, we should see similarities in building techniques, common architectural principles, and we do. Pyramids. Mesoamerica is famous for stepped pyramids. Teotihuacan, Chichen Itza. Massive stone structures built with astronomical alignments. Pyramids also appear in Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Southeast Asia, all using similar principles, stepped structures, astronomical orientations, massive stone construction requiring sophisticated engineering and social organization. Mainstream archaeology treats this as independent invention. Each culture figured out pyramids separately because it's a logical architectural form. But the similarities are specific, not just stacked stones, precise astronomical alignments, mathematical proportions, construction techniques that require advanced knowledge. Either every culture independently developed the same complex systems, or there was knowledge transmission, shared origin, cultural contact. Then there's polygonal masonry, massive irregular stones fitted together without mortar, each stone uniquely shaped, joints so precise you can't fit a blade between them. This technique appears in Peru, at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo. Stones weighing over 100 tons cut and fitted with extraordinary precision. Similar techniques appear in ancient sites across Turkey, Russia, and other locations. Not identical, but sharing core principles that suggest common knowledge base. Modern engineers find these techniques difficult to replicate. The precision isn't just aesthetic, it's structural. The stones interlock in ways that distribute weight and resist earthquakes. This is sophisticated engineering, not primitive stacking. How did cultures separated by oceans develop the same advanced techniques? The mainstream answer is parallel development. But that requires believing that multiple cultures independently invented highly complex methods that we struggle to recreate with modern technology. The alternative is knowledge transmission, either through sustained contact between cultures or through migration of peoples who already possess this knowledge. If Fernando's accounts are accurate, if northern peoples migrated to Mexico bringing architectural knowledge, these similarities become explicable. They built in the Americas using techniques learned elsewhere. Local variations developed over time, but core principles remained. Return to the Olmecs, the first major civilization in Mexico, appeared suddenly around 1200 BC. Everything that came after, the Maya, the Aztecs, the other Mesoamerican cultures, traces influence back to the Olmecs. They established patterns in art, religion, writing, astronomy that persisted for thousands of years. But we don't know where they came from. No clear predecessor. No gradual development from simpler cultures. Just emergence of sophisticated civilization. Their art shows remarkable skill. The colossal heads are the most famous, but they produced jade carvings, pottery, and architectural elements of exceptional quality. And they had knowledge, a calendar system, writing that we still don't fully understand, astronomical observations precise enough to track celestial cycles. This isn't primitive culture. This is advanced civilization. The question is, where did they get this knowledge? Did they develop it independently in isolation? Or did they bring it from somewhere else? If we take Fernando's migration account seriously, the Olmecs could represent the earliest wave of northern peoples arriving in Mexico, bringing knowledge, establishing civilization, creating the foundation that later cultures built upon. The genetic evidence is inconclusive. Modern DNA studies of indigenous Mexican populations don't show recent major admixture from Asia. But genetics can be complicated. Small founder populations can be absorbed over generations. Markers fade. What remains is the cultural evidence, the sudden appearance, the advanced knowledge, the architectural sophistication, the oral traditions documented by Fernando describing migrations from the north. None of this proves transoceanic contact, but it creates a pattern, a series of questions that the standard isolation model doesn't answer satisfactorily. The word itself is interesting. Chichimeca. In Nahuatl, Chichimeca was a term for northern peoples, not a specific tribe, a category. The way Europeans used barbarian or Tartar, collective terms for peoples from outside the civilized regions. The Aztecs used Chichimeca to describe semi-nomadic groups from the desert areas north of the Central Valley. Sometimes the term was derogatory, sometimes neutral, but always indicating outsiders, people from beyond the borders. Fernando used the term differently. In his histories, the Chichimeca aren't vague barbarians, they're ancestors, the peoples who migrated from the far north, the founders of civilization. And here's where the linguistic parallel becomes interesting. Europeans called the peoples of northern and central Asia Tartars, a collective term, not a specific ethnicity but a category for the populations of the steppes, the outsiders from unknown territories. Aztecs called northern peoples Chichimeca, also a collective term, also indicating outsiders from unknown territories. Both terms serve the same function, labels for peoples from beyond the known world, from the mysterious north. When Fernando documented Chichimeca origins, he was recording traditions about northerners, and when European cartographers mapped the northern territories, they labeled them Tartaria. The geographic overlap is notable. The regions Fernando describes as origin points for Mexican peoples align with territories European maps label as Tartarian. This doesn't prove the peoples were identical, but it suggests the possibility of connection, that what Europeans were calling Tartarian territories and what Mexican traditions remembered as the homeland of the Chichimeca might refer to overlapping populations and regions. If these migration accounts are accurate, if peoples from northern territories brought knowledge to the Americas, we should see physical evidence, not just oral traditions, not just linguistic patterns, but tangible proof in the landscape and artifacts. And we do. Start with the most obvious, the pyramids themselves. Not just that they exist in multiple locations, but how they were built. Teotihuacan. Construction began around 100 BC. The Pyramid of the Sun contains over 1 million cubic meters of material. The entire complex covers over 20 square kilometers. The astronomical alignments are precise. The Avenue of the Dead points 15.5 degrees east of true north, exactly aligned to the setting of the Pleiades constellation as it appeared in that era. This isn't approximate. This is mathematical precision requiring sophisticated astronomical observation over extended time periods. The knowledge to calculate these alignments, the engineering to execute them in massive stone construction, the social organization to coordinate the labor. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard answer is independent development. The peoples of Mesoamerica figured it out themselves through observation and experimentation. But the specific techniques appear elsewhere. Not similar, identical. The Chinese pyramids in Shanxi province, step structures, astronomical alignments, mathematical proportions that match Mesoamerican examples. built thousands of years ago by cultures that supposedly had no contact. The construction methods, the orientation principles, the mathematical relationships between structures. These aren't general similarities, these are specific shared knowledge systems. Either multiple cultures independently invented identical complex systems, or there was transmission, contact, migration of peoples who already possessed this knowledge and built in multiple locations using the same principles. Then examine the stonework, the polygonal masonry at Sacsayhuaman in Peru. Stones weighing over 120 tons, cut with precision, fitted without mortar. The joints are so exact that after 500 years of earthquakes, you still cannot insert a knife blade between stones. Modern engineers study these walls and cannot definitively explain the techniques. The stones aren't rectangular blocks. Each one is uniquely shaped. Three-dimensional jigsaw pieces that interlock in ways that distribute weight and resist seismic activity. This same technique appears in ancient sites across Turkey, in the Caucasus region of Russia, in Lebanon. The same principle